It's been called the biggest social justice protest movement in the history of America. Blacks, whites, Latinos, Asians, young, old, men, and women all locked arms for months last summer, and they called for justice for George Floyd, and they also called for the arrest, prosecution, and conviction of the white Minneapolis cop who kneeled on the neck of Mr. Floyd for almost 8 minutes as he called out, "I can't breathe." And in his last breath, Mr. Floyd called for his mama as his body surrendered to the unthinkable pressure and brutality. Well, the trial of that former cop involved in this horrific display of police violence, Derek Chauvin, started on Tuesday of this week. And today, we are breaking down the trial and the quest for justice and accountability with the nation's leading criminal and civil rights attorneys and activists. My friend and president of the National Urban League, Marc Morial, is here. And I kick off the show with a one-on-one interview with Wanda Johnson. She's the mother of Oscar Grant, who was killed by Oakland Transit Police in 2009. Wanda has firsthand insight into the personal and community trauma of police violence. All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report.
This Tuesday, jury selection began for Derek Chauvin, the former Minneapolis cop who kneeled on the neck of George Floyd in May of last year, causing him to die, and for the nation to take to the streets to demand accountability. Chauvin has been charged with second-degree murder and manslaughter, and recently a third-degree murder charge was reinstated, giving the prosecution multiple pathways to a conviction. In a trial that's expected to last 8 to 10 weeks and involve graphic videos and emotional testimony, legal experts are warning us to exercise caution. They point to the acquittal of police officers in other high-profile cases as evidence that holding police accountable for the murders of Black men, even when it's caught on videotape, is never easy and often elusive. As protesters gather, Mr. Floyd's family and the entire Black community is reliving the trauma of Mr. Floyd's murder and grappling with the fundamental question of whether Black lives in America will ever matter. Here for the interview is Wanda Johnson. She is the mother of Oscar Grant, who was killed by Oakland Transit Police in 2009 at the tender age of 22. His tragic death is the subject of the movie Fruitville Station, starring Michael B. Jordan and Octavia Spencer. Wanda has been a guest on the program before, and I'm so glad that she agreed to join us again this morning. Good morning, Wanda.
Good morning, and thank you for allowing me to be on your show again.
You know, it's always such a treat to be able to sit down and talk with you, but it's always, unfortunately, it's been around these really, emotional and unthinkable tragedies, like the tragedy that happened to your son, Oscar. So I always like to just start off by asking you, how are you doing? It's been, over 10 years now since Oscar was killed by police, but I know as a mother, that pain can never go away.
And that's true. I'm still adjusting. Been working with the case, trying to get it reopened. And she has reopened it, but she's looking into it if she can go back and charge the officer. So it brings up a lot of emotions, mixed emotions, just to start over again of the process of, getting officers charged. It seems like it start over again with the beginning of what happened with Oscar.
Yeah, and as I was doing my research for the show last night and looking back at what happened with Oscar, I was reminded that Oscar's case has some similarities to George Floyd. One of the officers involved in Oscar's case had his knee. He was kneeling on Oscar before he was shot by the other officer. So when you see what's happening with the George Floyd case, are you just forced to relive that trauma all over again?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think about how Oscar was telling them that he couldn't breathe, and then listening to George Floyd say, that he couldn't breathe, and calling his mother. I can't imagine how, someone can still be on your knee, causing you to aspirate, and be on your neck and causing you to aspirate and asking, and telling you that they can't breathe, and nothing is done to get that person off your neck. Oscar faced that. George Floyd faced it until, he ended up passing away, dying, being killed literally. And so it's just a very difficult time and difficult situation to even have to live through again.
Yeah. And one of the things, again, similarities, we know in George Floyd's case, there was someone there videotaping a young woman. There were, multiple witnesses there calling to these police officers, telling them, to stop. He can't breathe, check his pulse. And also in your son's case, these cases don't happen in isolation. Like, in the dark of the night in an alley, there were also witnesses there, in your son's case, as he was having this altercation with police officers. What can you tell us about? And I know you've had so much time to participate in the trial and hear what the witnesses have to say. Help us understand what that trauma is like for those that are left, like yourself, as family members of victims, as well as those that witness this level of brutality.
What often happens for our young men, African American young men and brown young men, when they are killed at the hands of police, it first starts with the media trying to change the hearers and viewers' mind of that person. And when they begin to do that, there's a negative stereotype. For Oscar, they thought he was going for a gun. He was resisting arrest. He was fighting with the officers. All of that was said for my son Oscar. And then for George Floyd, as I look at him, he had drugs in his system. He had blocked arteries. He had high blood pressure. He had fentanyl, all kind of negative things to get the audience to say that, that person wasn't even worth, being in our society in the first place. And, as it starts there, then the jury pool, many of them say they haven't heard of the case or they heard of it, and, they would be fair about their decision. When oftentimes for my son's case, there was not one African-American person on the case. And I know right now there's about 6 jurors picked, I believe, and there's only one so far African-American lady on the jury for George Floyd. And so it's all the stereotyping that has been done that puts these prejudices in the minds of some of the jurors to make them come back with an unfavorable decision. And, that really, we have to look at that, when the prosecution and the defense are selecting the jury pool.
You raised such such an important point, Wanda, about how African American men who've been killed by police are portrayed in the media, and the attacks and the efforts to paint them as villains, to make them less than human, to deny them their humanity by delving into their background. Like you said in George Floyd's case, we know that one of his relatives had to leave the courtroom yesterday because as they were doing the voir dire, the questioning of the jurors, there were so many questions about this alleged drug use and the use of drugs, or the alleged use of drugs by George Floyd. And it just repulsed her to the point that she had to bolt out of that courtroom. We saw that with Trayvon Martin, this teenager that they, tried to paint these dark images. Oftentimes the pictures that they use of African-American men, again, try to paint them in this dark, very inhumane, menacing light. And you're right. Jurors walk into those courtrooms, and in these high-profile cases, they have seen these stories, they've seen these images, and they're seared in their minds. But yet then they're somehow asked to separate those negative, inhumane, menacing photos from, this person, this victim that has lost their lives. And I want to talk some about the trial. I know in Oscar's case, one officer charged. One officer wasn't even charge. So
Mhm.
we know in this country, even charging an officer, uh, is a very difficult process. What was it like for you going, working with a DA's office and trying to get justice for your son and being, I imagine, met at every point with some resistance?
So for my case, it was the first time in California history an officer ever got charged with an on-duty shooting. And, working with the district attorney, uh, first, I know that they didn't even want us in the courthouse. And it was said several times by the guards and stuff that was there. um, Even when they moved the case 400 miles, where we had to drive to Los Angeles to attend court session because they said that the jury in the Alameda County, everyone had heard, so they would not be able to do a fair verdict.
Right.
And just uh, dealing with all of that and going to LA and listening to how the judge, was he already said he already had his decision. This case is going to last 2 weeks. We're not going to let if you leave the protesters out there, we're going to keep them out. We're going to have this last for 5 years. So it was a combination of so many things. But what hurt the most is how how my son who was killed was painted. Um, and I'm sure that George Floyd's family will go through the same thing, that they would try to paint him like as if he killed the officer or if as if he deserved to be killed. And they did the same thing, with my son's case, and when people who testified for what happened with my son would cry, we would have to recess. But when the officer was allowed to testify, not only was we not recessed, but he could cry right there on the stand to appeal to these jurors. And so it has to be made fair. If you're not going to allow those who are testifying for George Floyd to cry on the stand, then by goodness, when that officer, if he takes the stand, if he begins to cry, they need to stop that and not allow that to go on. It was so many unfair things that happened during my son's trial that I could, never, get over. Only a certain amount of my family members was allowed in. We had family who waited outside. Um, only, only we couldn't wear. We was only supposed to wear different, a certain type of clothing. If we had the wrong clothing on, we would not be allowed in the courtroom. So it was many things that was done that was unfair. The officer who killed my son, first he said my son was going for a gun. So if you're going for a gun, an officer would not use a taser. And so he shot my son. And then my son died. And he ends up with 11 months in a county jail because the judge said, oh, I gave the jury the wrong instructions. So I'm going to have to throw that out. And we knew from the very beginning that we were in a situation where we would not come out favorable just because of how the judge was siding with the police officer's attorney the whole time. He would tell my attorney, be quiet, you're talking too loud. But the police's attorney, Raines, he could yell and do all kind of things, and there was nothing. I want to call this foul the KKK foul. So it was so many things done in that courtroom that should not have happened, that did happen. And our society can't allow that to go on in the case with George Floyd against the officer.
So, Wanda, you made a good point that your son's case was the first case, a criminal trial against an officer in California. That was back, your son's shooting happened in 2009. Here we are, 2021, and some would say not a whole lot has changed. That we still face a system that is stacked against African American when it comes to getting accountability for police shootings or murders like we're seeing in the case of George Floyd. I just ask you before I let you go, is there one piece of advice you would give to the Floyd family? They're having to grieve under this microscope everything that's happening in this trial, and in this case is being played out, before an international audience. But this isn't, a headline for them. This isn't a statistic for them. This isn't even a bill in Congress. This is their brother. This is their dad. This is their loved one. So is there any piece of, it's personal, mom to family member to family member advice you would give to the family as they go through what's going to be a very emotional and grueling trial process?
Again, my condolences to his family. And I would say to that family to stay away from the media and the watching television, a lot of the news, and reading it, and even on Facebook, because during this time, people are going to try to demonize George Floyd so bad. And, we as parents, as brothers and sisters, you love that loved one. And no matter what that loved one, that's still your family member. And so I would say to stay away from, the media that's going to talk and try to demonize him. In the courtrooms, to hug each other, to hold hands, because some of the testimonies and some of the words that's going to come out of the attorneys' mouths are not going to be favorable towards Floyd. And so as they listen to that process, if they need to get up and go to the restroom to cry, do that and come back. Or even if they have to cry and put their head down in there, do that. But to stay strong and continue to fight, continue to stand, that George Floyd deserves justice. And everyone who watched that video know that that young man, whether he had prior sickness, whether he had prior drug use, whatever he had prior, at that very minute did not matter, and that he did not deserve to lose his life unjustly. And so because of that, that family has to stand on that, no matter what the society says. And as they stand on it in that courtroom, know that justice, whether it comes by this officer serving time, and a lot of time, justice is going to come by God. But know that as they walk through this process, that number one, George did not deserve to die. He did not deserve to be killed. And we as a society have to do much, much better and begin to hold officers accountable for their actions without trying to say, oh, what you see is not really what happened. When we as Americans know exactly what we saw and what happened, and that officer should have had the restraint to get off that man when he began to say that he cannot breathe. And because he did not, he should be held accountable for his actions. And so to that family, I say, hug each other, stand strong, and know that George did not die in vain. And because of him, our laws are going to have to change, and we are going to have to start holding officers accountable for their egregious actions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wanda. Always a pleasure to sit down with you. Your voice is so incredibly important during this time. Thank you for the advocacy that you're doing around police violence, and just working to make communities safer, not just in California, but throughout the country. Again, thank you so much. And always, my heart goes out to your family on the loss of your son. All right, coming up next,
Thank
we're
you.
breaking this trial down minute by minute, and we're doing it with some of the best lawyers in the country. So joining me this morning is attorney Marc. He secured the acquittal for George Zimmerman after he was charged with killing Trayvon Martin. And also joining me is acclaimed civil rights attorney John Burris, who actually represented Oscar Grant's family and was also the attorney in the civil case of Rodney King, whose beat down by the LA police on videotape captivated the nation. Good morning, John, and good morning, Marc.
Yeah, good morning.
Great
All
to be
right.
here.
Always so emotional. I've had Wanda on my show a couple of times, and I always like to talk to her because as she said, she went through this over 10 years ago. Her son being killed by Oakland Transit Police, and John, you were there with the Grant family, so you know the story all too well. Marc, you secured an acquittal in George Zimmerman. involving the shooting of Trayvon Martin. So I'll just start with you. What can the defense learn from the George Zimmerman trial that you think is applicable to the Chauvin trial?
Well, I was just spoken about, ignoring the media is probably a good idea because, as we know, Areva, the thing about the media involvement in these cases is it really just touches the white caps. So it's very difficult. But as far as what the defense can learn, I will tell you, it's going to be a very, very difficult trial for the prosecution. And the reason why I say that is because we know from past history, 10, 15, 20 years of it, it is very difficult to convict a cop. It just is, no matter what. Now, the George Floyd case seems to be sort of the one poster case you can look at and say, if anywhere we're going to look at and hold an officer responsible, it will be this one. No one can look at those 8 minutes of video and say anything else. But we also know in other cases, I had another case where I represented Sam DuBose, shot and killed by a law enforcement officer, an off-duty University of Cincinnati police officer on video, and he seemed to lie about why he did it. And nonetheless, they tried that cop twice, could not get a conviction in either one. They finally let him go. So unfortunately, even with a video, it is not foregone conclusion of a conviction. And what the defense is going to do is, I presume, argue he did what he was trained to do. He did it because he thought he had to do it. Mr. Floyd was doing something to justify continued restraint. I don't know how they're going to actually convince 12 people that it was justified, but that's their job in this case.
Yeah, John, you go all the way back to Rodney King, to the 90s, where we first, saw shocking videotape of police in action brutalizing Rodney King, and what we thought again would be an open and closed case. And we saw in the initial trial of those officers, they were all acquitted. Why is it, John? Help us understand. I'm a lawyer, I get it. But for my viewers who are saying, how can we watch this on videotape and it not be an open and shut case?
Well, I think Marc has hit on it, having been involved in countless police misconduct cases, many of whom I thought should have been criminally charged. It's a real challenge for the prosecution because, unfortunately, the world, and at least our world, is set up where police are given the benefit of the doubt, and jurors do not want to convict police officers for work they did in the ordinary course of business. If there's no prior relationship and it happens circumstantially, when it does organically, a jury has to work real hard to ascribe criminal motive to it, even if it's a bang-bang situation. I would only say this. In this case, there's a more of a possibility than a lot of other cases, because if you look at the officer's conduct and his demeanor at the time he's holding down George Floyd, there was a lack of disinterest in him as a human being. To me, that doesn't get you to murder. I don't think you get this murder 2 in this case. No. Maybe you get to murder 3, but you're probably more likely to get to a manslaughter. And I think that even in Wanda's cases, we tried that case or thought that case was at least a manslaughter case or a voluntary or a second. It came out involuntary, which means almost a negligence case. And so I can see something like that happening here, if nothing else. It is difficult, as one can imagine, when you have to deal with the police, and particularly in a criminal case, because the general population wants to believe that police are there to protect them. And if you have people on the jury that's like them, those people are protective of that person. If you had African Americans on that jury, they won't have this presumption that the officer was there to protect them. But in the white community, they do. And you have to overcome that. I always tell people, we don't start even in situations with the police. We do not start even. The police starts at a higher level than the average everyday person. And so convicting them is a monumental task. It can't happen in this case. Just like in the Rodney King case, I will tell you, it did happen later in the federal criminal trials, and then we were able to do it in a civil. But in the state case, which is what this case is, they couldn't do it. They didn't get all convictions, but in most part, they were not. The jurors were on the side of not convicting these officers. I can see that happening. The only thing I would say here is different. The climate now is different. We have 30 years of Rodney King. We have numerous cases of video cameras to see what police have done. And in my work now, as I have police cases, people are much more aware of what police do, and they now understand that police don't always act appropriately. And as a consequence of this 30-year period, you do have a greater in-depth knowledge on the part of the general community. Now, whether that's true in that community itself, it remains to be seen. You still have to deal with the presumption that police officers get the benefit of the doubt. Although I will say in jury selection in this case, there's much more evidence by the jurors who are there that there is the prior relationship between misconduct by police and the community. So there's an undercurrent that's there that was not always there. So I think that raises the possibility of a conviction from the jury. Not second-degree murder, I don't believe. Maybe involuntary of some kind, but certainly not. It could happen. And I'm not dismissing that it won't happen. I think it's a greater possibility of happening in this case than others, even though other cases have maybe greater acts of brutality on its face. The times are different now. That's the big issue going on.
We're going to talk a little about the jury selection later, but Marc, I want to ask you about these charges because John has brought up the manslaughter charges, and we know that the third-degree murder charge was reinstated by the court. So now there's a second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and a second-degree manslaughter. Walk us through, Marc, what those charges mean and why it's significant that that third-degree murder charge was reinstated.
Sure. Yeah, I agree that it will be very difficult to get a second-degree murder conviction here. And the reason why is in that state, second-degree murder means you intended to cause the death, but without premeditation. So premeditation murder is, I decide I'm going to kill somebody and I go effectuate it. That's premeditated. Their second-degree murder is, I didn't premeditate it, but as I'm doing it, I decided to kill. Very, very difficult standard, if you think about it, for them to say, for the jury to say to Chauvin, you made the affirmative decision to kill George at that moment. And I don't think that they're going to get that conviction because it's very difficult. However, I think it's very, very significant and very important for the prosecution and therefore for the Black community that third-degree murder charge is present, because what that says is very similar to in Florida. It's called second-degree murder. It's depraved mind murder. It is, you acted with such a depraved mind, evidencing a lack of care about human life. And if they look at that and say, look, you may have started out doing what you thought you needed to do, get control over George Floyd. Okay, we got that. But at some moment during those 8 minutes when you had control, when you had 3 or 4 other officers, then you should have looked at that and said, what am I doing? And his continued use of that neck hold, I think they will say that evidences a depraved mind. You did not care about human life at that point. And that's why I think the third-degree murder conviction, again, very important that the appellate court brought it back in. I wish the trial judge had gotten to it earlier. I'm a little bit concerned about some of the jurors not knowing about it, but that's fixable. But I do think that is a legitimate charge that the jury could easily look at the facts of this case and say he should be convicted of that. I further agree that they may compromise and say, because he's a cop, because we like cops, because even in today's day and age, we don't like convicting cops of anything, that they may bring it down as a compromise verdict to the manslaughter. But I will tell you, Areva, and if this was a law school exam question, is that third-degree murder under Minnesota law? The answer is yes.
Yeah.
I will say one thing that helps on this, on the murder, is that there was a prior relationship that existed between them. And if that information comes out, that there was some relationship that existed, good or bad, which then means that the officer knew who he was and acted in a way that can perceived to be vindictive, in the sense that you knew him, you either liked or you didn't like him. He was a new guy in town. And you could very well use that. If I'm the prosecution, the plaintiff lawyer, I would use that to suggest there's more to this than not. Right. This was a prior relationship and this officer knew him, and maybe he didn't intend to kill him at the time, but he was intending to embarrass him to humiliate him, because that's what you are doing when you're putting your knee on the back of his neck, and to show him and demonstrate that you're in control of him. That can easily get you, I think, to the third degree, and maybe not more than third. It won't get you past third degree, but it can get you third degree. And I think that will go much, if anything, to the question of a conviction of some kind. That
interaction you're talking about, John, is we know that there's reports that Chauvin had some altercation or some interaction, I'll call it, with George Floyd prior to that day in May. So you're saying
that's what I'm talking about,
right? That could be substantial.
Yeah. And that's the type of ill will, if I might, that's the type of ill will or hatred. That's a type that gets in on second-degree murder cases in Florida and third degree in Minnesota, because if you can show prior hatred or dislike, right, then it sort of moves forward into, okay, Chauvin was acting with that dislike and lack of care or actual ill will towards Floyd. If that comes out, that, like was just said, that's sort of a connection point, right, for where they got to get hatred, because you still have to get Chauvin acting with ill will. Now, I'm not just doing my job. I'm not just mistrained. I'm not overstepping my training. I don't like you. And if that comes out, that's the third degree murder conviction in Minnesota.
Well, let me ask you this, Mark. There was some talk about a plea deal right after Chauvin was arrested. And then there were headlines that Bill Barr shut this plea deal down, but that it involved the Justice Department agreeing not to, go forward with federal civil rights violation charges, and somehow Chauvin serving his time in a federal prison versus a state prison.
Right.
Apparently, Barr said no, that would be seen as too lenient. I guess he was going to get 10 years or so. How unusual is it for a defendant like Chauvin to say, hey, I'll plead guilty if I can do my time in federal prison, and try to work a deal with both the state prosecutor as well as the Justice Department?
Sure. It is very unique, and it is very creative, and may turn out to have been a very good move by Chauvin, according to what happens here in this case. I was very surprised that former Attorney General Barr stuck his nose into this case the way he did. I would like to think that he did it because he thought it was, in fact, too lenient, and that he wanted to keep open the opportunity for the federal government to charge Chauvin, although that would be unusual for former Attorney General Barr. But taking him at his word, and that he really wanted to leave open the opportunity of charging a cop with civil rights at a time when Attorney General Barr was doing away with the civil rights prosecutions at the federal level, is a unique insight in and of itself. But it is very unique. And again, if Chauvin gets convicted of third degree and serves between 10 and 25 years in prison, which he certainly probably would get on that conviction, then, the idea of a very early move by his defense counsel and Chauvin himself to say, you know what? I messed up. I did wrong. Someone died because I did wrong. I'm willing to own up to it and serve my time. 10 years is a healthy length of time, not necessarily for the intentional death of somebody the way this happened, but do it in federal prison, because we all know federal prison is slightly better. Very creative and a good move. And I tell you, if Chauvin gets convicted of second or third, I think he wished he would have moved forward with that prior offer to plead guilty and get a 10-year sentence.
Yeah. I will say this, the judge knows about this, about the 10-year offer, and that the prosecution was willing to accept that. I say in my own mind, I'm thinking that's the kind of thing that the judge will remember, that all of you had agreed upon this at some point in time. I can see the judge then using that as a baseline in terms of making a decision at a later time on a conviction, particularly if it's a third degree conviction, because there was this discussion already about the time. Now, it may be that if it's a second degree, he couldn't do that, but certainly on a third degree, he could. And I would think that would be a factor that would be for him to consider and be mindful of.
Let's talk a little about this jury selection. We know, there's this thing in the law, where we're going to pick these impartial jurors who are going to be, a people who are, your fellow citizens. They're going to be people who are like you or have some similarities to you. And we know that's farcical in many ways. You just said, John, about, jurors, often white jurors in particular, have one notion about police and their duty to protect and serve, and black jurors have a completely different understanding about what police do in their communities. We know, I guess, 6 or 7 jurors have been seated already in this case. There are 3 white men. There's a black man, there's a Hispanic, and there's a woman of mixed race. If those were the jurors frozen in time, what does that jury makeup tell you, John, about the likelihood of a conviction?
Given the 6 that we have here, that's kind of unusual and surprising, given the demographics of the area. I will tell you that in a police case, this for the prosecution, this really turns everything upside down for them, because they are generally working with the police. They know they're going to get police jurors. They're going to be helpful to them. Now they're placed in a position where they have to prosecute a police officer, and many of the people who would normally be on their side starting out are not. And this is a challenge for them. So I've been very curious as I've watched the examination and prospective jurors as to what they're trying to explore. I think they've been generally pretty fair about this, because the jurors themselves have been pretty open-minded. This is a jury that seemed relatively sophisticated about what has taken place. That's an easier challenge for the prosecution to at least probe, because that's what you're doing, is probing. The defense is doing a pretty good job in probing. But I think because it's a police case, it's very difficult for the prosecution to get a real reading on the people they're selecting, because they're not accustomed to having people on a jury who when you're prosecuting the police, that are pro-police. And you pro-police in this case will be against you. So I'm finding it very interesting and challenging, because I know that these kind of cases are very difficult for the prosecution. And in part, that's why they don't do them either, because they don't have people in the community that they feel good about, unless they have a slam dunk case. They don't do them.
Yeah. And Marc, a lot of questions for those jurors about drug use. We know that George Floyd's family member walked out of the courtroom because there were so many questions about his alleged use of drugs. How important is his prior history going to be around drugs? And the second question to you is about these experts. We know there's some dueling autopsy reports. How important is that going to be to ultimate decision in this case?
So as far as the drug use, one of the primary goals of good jury selection is to insulate the jurors from what is coming out in the case. I had somebody talk to me and ask me the question, how are they going to find 12 people who don't know anything about the case? That's not what you want. If you have anyone who doesn't know about this case is living under a rock and should never be on a jury. Let's face that. You want somebody who has an awareness of what's going on, both a social awareness of these issues in the criminal justice system, and also are paying attention to what's going on in the country around them. So you don't want somebody ignorant. You want somebody who's aware of what's going on, but is willing to acknowledge their own biases, their own prejudices, the prejudices that exist in the criminal justice system. If you can start focusing your jury selection on those type of issues, now you're insulating that jury so that when they go back to the jury room, they'll actually be willing to acknowledge those biases. And if you can talk about them in jury selection, then it almost gives them license to talk about it when they're acting as a jury. So you want to get that across to them. The idea about the drug use itself, again, it's going to come out most likely because of the toxicology and whatnot, that George had some drugs in his system. And it may come out, prior record may or may not come out. But what you want to do is at least focus on the fact that that is an issue. Make sure there's nobody on that jury who, once they hear about drug use, is going to be so incensed about it, maybe some drug use in their family that led to a tragedy, whatever. You want to insulate them from that. So that's the main reason why I think there are a lot of questions about drug use. It sounds like an indictment of Mr. Floyd, and I know it comes across that way to the family, but good lawyers know that it's an insulation technique to try and sort of accomplish getting an impartial or less biased jury. Now, as far as the experts, every expert, is going to have a different opinion from another expert, and good lawyers are going to be using their experts to their benefit. My thought is that even though there is this argument of, how did he die or why did he die? My thought is that if the prosecution does their job and shows what they need to show, then the idea that George may have died because, he had some of this in his system or some of that in his system, I don't think that a good, intelligent jury is going to care. about the fact that George had something in his system. I think they're going to look at the knee, look at the neck, and say you caused his death. And this science of excited delirium and things like that that they say happen, I think that should fall, and I think it will fall on deaf ears if the prosecution does their job well, because the focus needs to stay on what Chauvin did and what he did to cause the death.
I'm running
The
out of
experts
time, John.
themselves-
But real quick, John, I'm running out of time. But real quick question for you: who's the star witness for the prosecution? If you had to name one star witness, who is it?
Oh.
The videotape. Videotape is the star witness without question.
The person who took the video is the star witness, because at the end of the day,
Without that videotape, we may not have a prosecution.
Face it. And
Let's face it.
we have
Without
to
that
try to overcome
videotape, I'm
that.
not sure we have a
Let's have to
prosecution.
overcome it. But the video is there, and the prosecution has to stay focused on that. But you have to cancel out the experts. I mean, I must tell you, the experts themselves will cancel each other out. And I think what Marc said is once you cancel them out, then the video becomes what's important, because experts, having been through a lot of them, excited delirium and other kinds of defenses, all of which are not, I don't think, particularly great, but they are there. And you never know what a jury will do with them, so you have to cancel them out. You have to have your expert who's also qualified. And once you do that, then you get down to the basic facts of the case. And that's where the video and the look in that officer's head and on his mind and his face at the time he was putting that knee on his neck and the length of time he did so will be the critical piece of evidence in the case.
Well, I got to leave it there. So much to talk about. Got to have you guys back. We're going to be watching this jury selection. We're going to be watching those opening statements that happen at the end of the month. Probably one of the most watched trials of this decade, if not, this century. Again, thanks for your expertise, John.
All right,
Thank
Areva.
you so much, Marc.
Thank you well. Stay healthy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you,
Take care.
guys. Appreciate
All
it.
right, take care.
All right, now my next guest is going to tell us what's happening on the grounds in Minneapolis. Her name is Sirius Marie. She's a member of the Twin Cities Coalition Justice for Jamar, an organization that started in 2015 after the death of Jamar Clark at the hands of Minneapolis police officers. Good morning, Sirius.
Good morning. Thanks for having me here.
Oh, thank you. You have been a part of the protest movement that happened after George Floyd was murdered back in May, and you've been on the ground leading up to this trial. Tell us what the energy is like in Minneapolis today.
It is very high. I think that it's very high. I think that it's a good feeling for me personally, because I'm not from this Minneapolis, Twin Cities area. I'm from the Chicago area in Illinois, a suburb right outside called Joliet. So coming from there in that environment and then coming here and seeing and experiencing the energy is really something that is hard to put into words, but it's something that as a Black woman that I really, really appreciate. There's a lot of support. It's not the same narrative as it may be spun. And that's also something that I want to be able to push out there whenever we protest. I know with, the National Guard being deployed and, Governor Walz trying to get support from other police and police organizations to come and police us is not something that's very needed and that the community is against, because whenever we do go out there to protest, it's more of a demonstration rather than a riot. And when you look deeper into how those things were incited, you really see where it's coming from rather than the people in the community, you know what I mean, that are really there to, be out there and vent, because as Black people and other people of color, but Black people especially, it's really hard to have a space where we can really release. So being able to protest out there, it's a good feeling. There's a lot of people out there and we just get to chant and sing and listen to people and get information and know who should we vote for? How do we go about those processes? Connecting with people that have similar interests and making friends and building a sense of community is really what it's like out here right now.
I'm glad you brought that up, because there's been so much negative media attention around the protests that erupted in Minneapolis and really around the country. A lot of focus on property damage and, business windows that were shattered. And you're portraying a picture of people, speaking their truths, getting information about voting, sharing information, moving forward towards legislation and other policy changes. Do you think even if there is an acquittal of this officer, and we just talked to the lawyers, they told us how difficult it is to get a conviction of a police officer, are you hopeful that the protests will remain peaceful even if there is an acquittal?
I'm hopeful that they will. I know that I can't control everybody. I know that me and as many marshals as we have, it can be hard, but we do our best to keep property damage to a minimum, because whenever things started in the very beginning, a lot of those demonstrations were unorganized. There weren't marshals and safety to keep people safe. But with TCC for J and what we've been doing, especially with demonstrations, is like we have marshals, we have sound trucks, we try to have water, we try to have accommodations to accommodate people, because it's more than a riot. It's like a place of gathering, like where people can feel like they're in a safe space to speak to one another. And then with the acquittal, hopefully, if he does get acquitted, which is something that we don't want, we can still brainstorm and have the same momentum with the movement to keep going, to get people to keep coming out. That way we can discuss next steps. And that's something that TCC for J has been working on and doing, drafting legislation for CPAC, which is CPAC, which is a community police accountability council, where we would basically be able to oversee and help and assist with investigations with representatives from districts within the Twin Cities community, to have people to represent them, to advocate for accountability of the police, which is like firing them, helping to amend unions and legislation and what they do and their consequences and firing and processes, investigations, things like that. And right now we're just kind of in the process of getting them to be able to get voted in so that we can have the legislation officialized and getting more support from more government and city officials, things like that, to kind of get this passed and sort of take after a little bit of what Chicago has going on with their CPAC and, their unionizing of police, and helping to get them so that we are unionized as a people to combat against this, gang union that is the police.
Well, I just want to thank you for your voice. Thank you for your advocacy. Thank you for coming on, giving us a sense about what's happening on the ground. We're going to definitely stay on this story on the special report, and we'd love to have you back, as the trial progresses. Again, thank you so much for being a voice, being a positive voice for young people and for African-American women. I really appreciate having a chance to sit down with you.
Thank you so much.
Want to talk to now some folks who've been at this work for a minute in terms of fighting for, civil rights, social justice, issues of police brutality. I want to bring into the conversation now former mayor of New Orleans and the national president of the National Urban League. He's also a friend of mine, went to school with his brother. And also want to bring on Chris Burbank. He is a VP with the Center for Policing Equity. Good morning, Marc, and good morning, Chris.
Hey, great to be with you. Hi, Areva. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Good morning.
Marc. Hey, Chris. Marc, what are you hoping for? You heard that young activist said what they're out there doing, what the protesters are doing. You heard the lawyer say getting a conviction of a cop is hard, even when we see what happens on videotape. I know you've been at this for a minute.
Yeah. I would say this.
So what do you hope?
That it is hard to get a conviction for an officer who engages in unconstitutional behavior is a commentary on our system. It's an overall commentary on the ability of the criminal justice system to hold itself accountable when the rights of people are violated. That's the heart of the issue. In the United States of America, no person is above the law. Not the president, not the Congress, not an individual police officer. Yet what we've done in the United States is that we have erected a set of both formal rules and informal practices that make it very difficult to hold police officers accountable when they violate the rights of citizens, particularly when they violate the rights of Black citizens. No individual person in the United States has as much power as a police officer who's carrying a badge and a gun and has the power to stop you from moving, detain you and arrest you, And then if they believe in their mind that they have to, want to, can cause you bodily harm with a billy club with their own hands or with a gun. That's the reality check. Now, Areva, today, this pandemic of police violence is the 21st century equivalent of lynching. From 1880 until 1940, thousands of people, mostly overwhelmingly Black people, were lynched. Yet, the Congress, the lawmakers, the politicians, to this day, never passed a law, never held any of these perpetrators, some of whom were Southern sheriffs, lawmen, term used in those days, in the time. So we've got to face this. And look, I come from a perspective that I would say is different than most. I was a lawyer who brought police brutality cases. I was a lawyer who represented Black police officers when they felt the disciplinary system of the city of New Orleans was discriminatory. And then ultimately, I became the chief executive of the city and launched one of the most far-ranging and successful police reform efforts in modern times, through which I fired nearly 100 police officers and sent several officers, with the cooperation of the then United States Attorney's Office. 2 officers are currently on death row for engaging in unconstitutional killings of people. I think that what is important for activists and others to know is that while we are focused on this judicial system and on this trial, as we should, and to me, the system is on trial. Yeah. Whether the system can hold its own accountable for something that happened and we plainly saw it. That videotape is going to be a very interesting commentary on the American criminal justice system. Now, having said that, for those that want long-term re-envisioning, reforms, restructuring, reimagination, changing of policing, we got to go to work with mayors, state legislators, city council members, where the power rests to really change the rules. And we need Congress, and it's now up to the United States Senate, to stiffen their backs and pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, not because it's a panacea, but because everyone has to do their part. Congress, US Senate, this is your part. At the local level, there are more things to do. We've got to, if you will, limit the excessive and inappropriate power of these so-called police unions.
Let me get Chris in this conversation, because he's been a police chief, Salt Lake City, and now you're working with a nonprofit organization, Center for Policing Equity. Why, Chris, are we still having this conversation about how difficult it is to hold police officers accountable 30 years after Rodney King, after we saw Rodney King be beaten almost to a pulp by LA police officers on that videotape, not one conviction in that first state police brutality trial against those officers? Why 30 years, still having the same conversation?
Well, interestingly enough, I began my police career with Rodney King occurring. That was the background as I started down the profession. And what we've seen time and time again, and Marc's exactly right, this is a system-wide failure, right? We have created this system that functions exactly like we intended. The problem is we just forgot to include a large segment of society as to whether or not they thought this was equitable or fair, and we have failed to remedy that. And so at this moment, while this trial, this murder should not go unnoticed or unaccounted for, more importantly is how are we going tomorrow to change this system so that this doesn't happen again? Time and time again, we repeat it.
Chris, you worked inside the system as a police chief. A 2020 study by Harvard found that Blacks are more than 3 times as likely. This is a report just came out last year. 3 times as likely as whites to be killed during a police encounter. How is it that in 2021, that we're still saying that a black man that has an encounter with the police is 3 times more likely to be killed than a white person.
Because we tend
Put
to
your
focus
police
on
hat
one.
on. Don't put your systems hat on. Tell me
All
what's
right.
happening in those police departments that make that statistic even conceivable.
Because we send young people out and say, solve this problem. No more crime. Go deal with this neighborhood. That's the bad neighborhood. And at all costs, accomplish your mission. And
Let
then
me
we
offer.
what was that?
I'm going to say when you're finished. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. And so there is no leadership in this. You're allowing 21 and 22-year-old officers to go out and just deal with the problem. And then you see time and time again, the lack of accountability inside the system, that if I get away with it once, or if that's how I handle it, or in some cases, I am receiving an award for the good work that I'm doing. I get a medal on my chest because they recognize this poor behavior, because it's zero tolerance. It's tough on crime. It's what the community expects. That's why we see this time and time again.
Jump in.
I was going to offer this conversation, and I think this is where policing, I noticed in Minneapolis, for example, in watching the tapes, that when there was, quote, a call for service at the diner that George Floyd allegedly passed a phony $20 bill. Now think about this. Allegedly passed a phony $20 bill. All of a sudden, 8 to 9 police officers descended on the site. I thought to myself, for what is fundamentally a misdemeanor, right? Fundamentally a misdemeanor, right? You're going to send 8 officers on a roll to the site. And I'm saying, why aren't those 8 officers doing something else? It was, to me, here we go again. Black man for a misdemeanor, not a robbery, not a physical threat, a nonviolent offense. All of a sudden, there are 8 officers, and he is, quote unquote, being arrested, not issued a summons, right? Not treated as though he might be a potential witness to something larger. So I saw, then when you looked behind the veil, what did you see for the Minneapolis Police Department? A very low closure rate, meaning they're not solving any crimes. They're not finding people who commit violent crimes. Then you saw a very low rate of sustained complaints. Thousands of complaints filed against the Minneapolis Police Department, small number being sustained. I looked at those two things. I said, broken system. When I was mayor, I paid attention to the close rate. I wanted to know what the close rate was. I wanted to know what the overall violent rate was. We brought violence down in the city of New Orleans and dramatically brought arrests down, because the philosophy in the community was not to go out and arrest people. It was to go be proactive in communities. And I'm going to say, philosophically, you got to change the way police. Now, one of the things it requires is changing the way you hire. You don't want Rambo mentality. You don't want people who think their job is to play proverbial cops and robbers.
Yeah.
You want people who have a good mind, who understand the overall philosophy, who have ability to build relationships with community. And this is called smart public safety. This is called working in the community. And so I think the broader system in the Center for Policing Equity works on these issues is we've got to change the philosophy of public safety and the philosophy of what a police department is to do. Some departments just sit back, wait for the 911 calls to come and just respond to 911, or they spend their time moseying around, making meaningless traffic stops for out tail light. I mean, this is a bigger issue of day-to-day philosophy and management of departments. And the better run departments don't do all these things.
Well, let's Chris. Marc is challenging the philosophy of policing in this country, saying we've got to have a fundamental change. You've worked both in policy and on the ground as a police officer. What's the two things that you think could happen immediately, should happen immediately in police departments around this country that would have a significant impact on those statistics that Harvard report found in terms of the likelihood of death when police encounter Black men? Two things that can change that dramatically.
First, you need to change the expectation, right? So we are not looking at arrests. We're not looking at tickets. We're not looking at traffic stops or even pedestrian stops, because there's no correlation between those and improved safety in our neighborhoods. Second, we need to change what police do, not just how they do it. We have constantly been focused on, let's make them more nice, right? Let's do this. When you study behavior, right, the racism you would expect from individuals within an organization would be accountable for X number of disproportionate stops. It is actually more than that, because we put in place this expectation of zero tolerance. We're writing tickets, and that does not produce safety. Never once have we been able to correlate arrests with improved safety.
All right. Sorry, out of time. Such a big conversation. Always
Hey, thank you. And
great to see you, Chris, too. Love your
It's
voice.
a pleasure.
Seems like you got some
Good
really
to be
good
with you
and
too,
practical
Chris.
solutions. We need your voice out there talking to those police departments around the country. And of course, Marc, keep doing the great work of the National.
Thanks, Areva. We'll see you next time.
Talk to you guys soon. Thank you.
Take care.
All right. Wow, such a good topic. I feel like we could spend hours talking about it. This trial is going to go on for at least 2 months. We're going to stay on this at the special report. You'll see me on CNN talking about this and other networks as well. But it's really, really important that we think about this case, this trial of Derek Chauvin. It's much bigger, as all of my guests have said today. This is not just the trial of one individual. This is really a referendum on policing in this country. And what happens in this trial will make a huge statement about where this country is and how ready, if at all, this country is in terms of addressing the systemic racism and the fundamental differences that endanger the lives of African American men. I don't know about you, but that Harvard report is shocking and startling to me. You know, that a Black man encounter with a police officer, it could be something as simple as a traffic stop for a ticket, a jaywalking encounter. Your headlight is out. Any simple encounter, 3 times more likely to die, which basically means Black men, try at your best to avoid any encounter with police, because it can turn out to be your last. It can turn out to be a deadly, deadly encounter. And that is scary. And that should be scary, not just for Black men, but for Black mothers like me, wives like me, sisters, Black people, white people, whoever you are. That study should be a catalyst for change in this country. And I sure hope that it is. Just a couple of words to live by before I get out. An injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Those are the famous words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Convicting Derek Chauvin is justice. Dismantling the systemic racism that plagues our criminal justice system is accountability. The world is watching to see if the United States, to see if jurors in Minneapolis will get this right. And if history has taught us anything, it will and does remind us that sadly, we cannot assume that we will do the right thing. I'm out, y'all. Don't forget to wear your mask. Be safe out there. And don't forget, we are all in this together.